can I please start by welcoming all of you to this last seminar in the series hosted by the School of Social Work and Social Policy at the University of Strathclyde. My name is Beth Weaver, and I'm a Professor of Criminal and Social Justice at the school. Before I introduce Rania, who many of you may well know, can I run through some tiny housekeeping rules? The seminar is being recorded, but this is only for Rania's presentation, not the discussion afterwards. That's not going to be recorded, so people can feel free to offer any opinions they wish without fear of recrimination or being held to account. But what we do ask then is that everybody keeps their microphones on mute and saves their questions until the end. Of course, you will see a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you are free to post any questions, comments, or even compliments in the chat function at any time, and we can discuss them at the end. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Rania Hamad. Rania will be discussing her ongoing doctoral research into how and why hate crime occurs. And she's looking at this from the perspective of people convicted of hate crime in Scotland. In addition to her doctoral research at the University of Edinburgh, Rania is also professional justice social work advisor for the Scottish Government. But she's seconded to the Scottish Government from her role as senior practitioner for hate crime and restorative justice in Edinburgh Council Justice Social Work Services. As such, I think we can agree that Rania has considerable academic and professional expertise on the phenomenon of hate crime in Scotland. And it is on that note that it is my privilege to invite Rania to take the floor.
Thanks so much, Beth. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for having me today, and it's lovely to see. I can see a lot of kind of names that I recognise, so people will hopefully know me. So I'm Rania Hamad. People might know me also as McGoran because I got married 3 weeks ago. So I'm using my maiden name for continuity today. So I'm speaking to you today in my capacity as in my PhD research purely in that capacity. Rather than obviously my kind of government role. I'm just going to share my screen just now. I'm just going to give a bit of a presentation that I'll hopefully be able to whip through some of it. I mean, this is a topic that, you know, you can have days and days worth of talking and training on it and so on. And so it's, you know, I will sort of try and get through things quite quickly. Now, try to think slideshow from beginning. Hopefully that'll work. Okay, so can everybody, Beth, if you let me know, everybody could see the presentation? Hopefully.
Yes, that's fine, Rania.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to a quick outline. I'm going to just obviously talk about kind of what is hate crime, a bit about current figures and prevalence, a little bit about current legislation, why is my research focusing on hate crime? Why is it important? The sort of so what of any research. A bit about the current theories and research on causes and motivations for hate crime. A little bit about what constitutes, again, some research on what is effective interventions for hate crime. What my research is trying to do, and obviously questions and discussion hopefully after. So as I say, I do have a lot of slides, and one of my PhD supervisors is here. I believe, and he's going to sort of shout at me for putting too much stuff on my slides. So hate crime, I mean, what is it? Normally I would ask audience participation in this and it's giving me some chat about what hate crime is, but obviously it's a bit difficult with this wider audience today. So defined at the moment as a crime motivated by malice or ill will towards a social group, and that tends to be the definition that is used. There's 5 protected characteristics in Scottish legislation and in criminal law. You'll see them there: race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity. Lots of definitional issues about the term hate. It's an emotive term. Are people truly motivated by hatred for another group or an individual? And that's what I'm really interested in my research, certainly looking at motivations as far as you can, when it's something that's kind of inside a person. And the review of Scottish hate crime legislation was introducing a new protected characteristic of age and the possibility of sex to be added. I'll come on to that briefly. So this is, sorry, it's a bit of a slightly blurry slide. I just wanted to kind of show that a little bit more context around that. So there's no sort of kind of offensive hate crime. There's offence types that then an aggravation is added to that of the type of prejudice. So, for example, you would, offences such as breach of the peace, so that's an older one now, assault, theft, murder, vandalism, and so on, threat and abusive behaviour would have aggravated by prejudice towards whether it was race, religion, sexual orientation, and so on. And there are those couple of standalone offences that are sort of still currently in Scottish law that I've noted at the bottom, stirring up of racial hatred and racial aggravated harassment. So sorry again for swiftly moving through a lot of these, but I want to get a chance for discussions. So as I say, it's all offence types. Hate crime covers from verbal abuse through to murder. Legislation allows an aggravator to be added. It occurs everywhere. You name it, hate crime can happen. It's not a thing that just happens in certain spaces. It's people's homes, it's streets, it's neighbours, it's pubs, places of worship, within schools, and then of course online. There's not always, I think somebody's maybe not muted, sorry. If I get distracted, it's not always the notion that it's just a stranger that kind of comes along and does that. Victims often know the perpetrator, so again, as I touched on, it might be someone's neighbour, it might be someone in their family. And there is some research about, I think I've included my stats on how frequently it is that people know the person doing it. Currently, so the Crown Office helpfully produce figures every year on the number of charges. So just to say, it's charges, not convictions, and it's not necessarily the amount of individuals. Someone could have multiple charges in one incident. So you can see there, I won't painstakingly go through the figures. You can see obviously race is the most commonly kind of reported / charged hate crime. And that's been a slight increase from last year. So I've sort of just added in what the increase is or decrease in religion, decrease there. It's what I will say, it's absolutely vastly underreported. Obviously many offence types are underreported, but hate crime really is for many reasons. Again, if we had more time, I would go into all the reasons, but you guys, I'm probably speaking to a lot of people here who know that and know about all of this, that many reasons why it's not reported. So these figures will never present a true picture of the everyday hostility and prejudice that people are facing, even in our lovely country of Scotland, unfortunately. So why research it? Again, my interest grew from practice. As Beth said, I'm a justice social worker and worked generically across justice services, and then was lucky enough to get a specialist role in exploring hate crime and our response to it in social work. Just might be people who don't know what justice social work is, but we work with people convicted of offences and receiving custodial sentences and community orders of all offence types. I then was lucky enough to do a knowledge exchange fellowship with the University of Edinburgh and worked with Dr. Steve Kirkwood, who I think is here, and Dr. Michael Rosie to do a short piece of work on researching it and really having that practical aspect for social work in Edinburgh. So that it grew from there, and skipping down a bit, the gaps that then identified through my little bit of desk research on that and talking to colleagues, there was really some gaps there about, there's loads on obviously the harms to victims of hate crime, which is so important, but not a lot on the accounts of people who commit it. So that's where the interest grew for the PhD, and thought, oh, there's a gap there. And under-researched areas such as disability, I think it's getting better now, obviously, but disability and transgender hate crime online, females who commit it, again, a small proportion. The harms of hate crime, again, we could have a whole other session on that to discuss the devastating impact that hate crime can have. And research does show that it is more detrimental to victims and communities than sort of parallel offending. So you could have, it's just a really crude example, like an assault that is committed on someone up the town, which is awful, really awful, but kind of research shows if that is motivated by the person's one of their personal characteristics, if it's something that's that they've been assaulted because of the race or the religion or how they look, how they, their sexuality, then the kind of impact of that is felt more keenly. And there's lots of research on that, really, really useful research. And the vicarious trauma that is felt. So it's not just about that individual victim, it's about communities of whole communities of people. Again, really interesting research about when people read about, for example, a homophobic attack in their local area. So a gay person might then completely change how they go about their life, their business. So the vicarious trauma felt not just by victims, individual victims, but families, communities, and obviously there can be a fatal impact at times. Awareness really is increasing. There's trigger events, lots more since Brexit was a big trigger event. Hate crime spiked. The pandemic, lots of media and political rhetoric and policies were worryingly we've been in a real horrible, scary time in terms of political kind of rhetoric and policies and things, and media. So there's increased attention from all quarters. Review of the hate crime legislation in Scotland's been timely. It's been going on now since Lord Brackadale's original report and recommendations, and as I say, the gaps in research. And for me, again, personally and professionally, there was I discovered through a bit of desk research initially, there was no real sort of national approach to hate crime, when we're assessing risk in that area, of people committing it again and of harm, and sort of interventions across kind of justice, social work services in Scotland. Just a couple of articles there about, just when I mentioned about the pandemic, has again thrown it into sharp relief about the rise in sort of hate crime against people Asian or perceived to be Chinese people because of the stuff around the supposed kind of source of the pandemic and things. So that has been something that police and communities have been dealing with. So again, it'll be interesting to see, this has all happened since I began my research, so it's just interesting to see what impact that has. Just quickly, the boring bits. In terms of law, hate crime legislation developed as a result, kind of really more fully developed as a result of the Stephen Lawrence murder. People will be, I'm sure, well aware of that, and identified a number of failings in the report into that. Hate crime legislation does serve a function in terms of it symbolically does send a message to people that it is not acceptable, that society and does condemn it. So it really does have that symbolic function as well as legally. And as I said, hate crime legislation carries with it that sentencers and decision makers should consider an enhanced penalty when it's a hate crime, when it's an offence aggravated by prejudice. So perhaps a larger fine, a slightly longer prison sentence, a longer community order, that kind of thing. Listed here are the current legislation. Again, I won't go through it all. Again, I'm sure people on the call will be aware of it, but that's the current suite of legislation we have. And of course, the recent introduction of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill, coming from a couple of years really of consultation and research. Again, just quickly, it seeks to modernise and consolidate and extend the existing hate crime legislation, including it updates some quite outdated terms that were in former legislation, such as intersex and so on. Adds age as a new protected characteristic, which can cover whether you're young or older, it's but reflecting, some kind of hate crime prejudice directed towards perhaps kind of older people as well. Allows sex to be added at a later date by secondary legislation, and there's the misogyny working group that's been set up around that. Useful to look up, because I do think they've had meetings and so on so far, and are looking at that. And introduces the new offence of relating to stirring up of hatred across all protected characteristics and not just race. So just a quickly, again, because I am a social worker and this is, I'm doing the PhD in social work. So why, in terms of the social work response to it and justice social work, certainly, as I say, it's something I think we do need to take account of because of that, the greater harm that can be caused. We in justice social work with both actually victims and perpetrators of hate crime. People we work with are also, they might commit offences, whether it's hate offences or not, but they also can be victims of hate crime themselves and of prejudice. And people obviously can generally experiencing inequalities across the board. So we have a really key role in social work to take account of that and work with people in the best ways. There is a little bit of desk research in Edinburgh showed it was kind of 1 in 8 reports for the sheriff courts we were doing were for a hate-related offence. So it is about trying to reduce reoffending and harm in this area and look at the best ways of kind of rehabilitation and moving on from it. We do this in specialist ways with other types of offending, like sexual and, this seems to be just moving on. With other types of offending. And as I say, there's not a consistent national approach. To be fair, the prevalence of hate crime does vary geographically, so I totally understand why areas, social work services in certain areas might go, it's not something that we are dealing with a lot in terms of people convicted and then coming through for assessments. So they haven't naturally developed services for that. So who commits hate crime and why? I'll just keep an eye on my pen. Okay, really crudely, and this is based on research that I've done just really on kind of white populations. It's not a worldwide sort of thing. It's a real snapshot of sort of keeping it for a kind of UK based research base. So twice as likely to be male than female, which reflects general criminal justice things. Age range, research says it's a younger age range, but that isn't, I don't think that's quite borne out actually in some of the kind of more Scottish trends. Ethnicity, we're in the UK, it tends to be white perpetrators, but we're in the UK where we do have a majority white population. Substance use is often a feature, particularly alcohol and the kind of disinhibiting effects of that. And people's socioeconomic background, again, tends to be, the research would say it's people who are sort of unemployed or a low income and do have previous involvement in offending. And as I say, caution with that, because people already in the justice system are more likely to come to the attention of the justice system, police and so on. So just that. So causes, in terms of causes of hate crime, I've grouped them, I've done a little coloured code that is in terms of my interest about the kind of individual levels, the kind of more middle level, and then the sort of wider level. So these are some of the, and I'll go through some of them in a bit more detail. Some of what the research would show is some of the sort of what causes hate crime, if you can attribute causality to something like that. So that you'll see them there, and then I will sort of go through them in the next couple of. So the role of prejudice, the research says that humans are kind of programmed to be prejudiced, unfortunately. I'm sure people in this meeting will be aware of that. We probably all work with humans in some capacity. So, there's a bit of a programming thing about humans, about grouping and classifying and things, but prejudice, it's then when it spills into prejudice, and then hate crime's the extreme end of prejudice. So it can range right from, just thinking something about someone right through to obviously committing an offence because of your prejudice. There's an interesting one to me about people's kind of personality types. Again, I don't know if it's hugely borne out in research, but I would like to know about that, the authoritarian personality, where people hold a range of prejudices against lots of people. So a kind of archetype of someone that rants about, they'll rant about this group, they'll rant about immigration, they'll rant about that group, they'll rant about, you name it, people that tend to support, the research said, capital punishment and corporal punishment. So again, I just want to see, is that something then that we do find? And the social psychological kind of levels for individuals is kind of mass media, political influence and rhetoric, and that kind of yearning for group acceptance that all humans sort of have and create an us and them scenario. Really rattling through these, I'm so sorry. The bits that really interest me as well is the concept of shame, the perpetrator's own sense of shame as a motivator, not shame about the offence, but actually just something about themselves. So there's really, really interesting research undertaken in Manchester in 2004 about people who had been committing hate crimes against Asian people of Asian origin, South Asian. And there was that, the researchers found there was this perception. The interactions were, for example, it was in a shop or so, and it was perhaps the shopkeeper, and they felt that they'd maybe made to feel small. There'd maybe been an incident, and they felt they were made to feel small. And because the research found that it was people who, in that area of Manchester, there'd been a lot of deprivation. They perceived the Asian people as thriving, and there was just something about their own sense of kind of shame about the incident itself and wider issues, and they were projecting that onto others and kind of rendering the victims as scapegoats for their own stuff. Again, but people, there was a bit of research about people, unemployed perpetrators, their own perceptions, that internalisation of kind of being work shy and so on, attacking immigrants for stealing jobs and benefits. And of course, dependent on the perpetrators' kind of own emotional mental health, what's going on in their lives, people who are more likely to explode in a crisis situation because of their kind of difficulties in managing emotions and so on, and often in the context of a conflict situation, a dispute over parking, a dispute over getting shortchanged in a shop, things like that. So that was a kind of those studies. Perceptions of loss as well around sort of places like Manchester and others, like deindustrialising towns and cities, perceiving that there's a loss to good old British values. There's communities are changing, that sort of stuff that can merge in with all of that. Really giving it a snapshot here. Linked to that, the kind of perceptions of threat, competition, realistic threat, competition over housing and employment and so on, between the in-groups and out-groups. And the in-group are seen to be, as I've said, the dominant identity, who have power in the UK, white, male, heterosexual, middle class. Again, something I really interrogating, because certainly the people that I've worked with committing kind of hate crime are they might be white and male, but certainly not people who actually kind of traditionally have power, people in the system, the justice system. Come on to that. And the symbolic threats, as I say, this threat to way of life, alien customs and values, notions that, down in London, there's whole areas that are under Sharia law and stuff. You hear it and unfortunately read it in lots of online comments. Never want to be cheered up, never look at, comments on an article about hate crime. And the community profiles thing is really interesting to me. It's about, because thinking about the communities that we work in, a lot of us probably here, what do we know much about what the tensions are? Research has shown it kind of areas that have got higher kind of tensions, have kind of entrenched racist views, social and economic deprivation, a lot of, maybe levels of youth subcultures and criminality. So just thinking about that and how our communities are shifting and changing. Another that I'm really interested in as well is gendered violence and masculine identities and kind of toxic masculinity. I've not went into loads here, but it's something I'm really interested in terms of, there's been other research about that and some interesting research in America, for example, on bias-related attacks on homeless people, and the kind of influence of toxic masculinity on that, and how it was about kind of asserting a masculine identity. So it's something I'm really interested in exploring as well. The kind of seminal about individual motivations was McDevitt and Levin back in the 90s that sort of came up with a typology of hate crime offenders based on 169 interviews and cases they looked at, and you'll see there, I won't go through it all in painstaking detail, but it kind of grouped it into what people's sort of more individual motivations were. So thrill-seeking, people defensive, as we said, motivated by a perceived threat from outsiders, interlopers, retaliatory. So we saw that, and actually after trigger events in the UK, and then after like 9/11, and after there's Manchester attacks, I put 2017, but actually there's been subsequent ones. Sorry, that's an older reference, but there's been subsequent things where you then see spikes against different groups of people. And the sort of mission offender, if you will, sorry to use that word, where it's rarer, but it's people who are more totally committed to an ideology of hate. So, you know, more likely to perpetrate serious or fatal violence. So the Norway attacks, Anders Breivik and things. So I'm interested to see, is more of that coming out? Is there, you know, this was older research, is there more of that militant mission level type offending with some of the rise of different political ideologies and things? So that'd be interesting to see. And not all types of hate crime seem to fit. They didn't look at disability hate crime. Yeah, there might be a thrill-seeking element to that, but there's exploitation is a big part of disability hate crime as well. And is that actually about hate, or is it about, so, and obviously it was an American population, so it's kind of looking at, I'm interested in what is going on in Scotland. Oh, right, it's just in here so that you can at some point look at it in future. It was typologies of online hate perpetrators, which is really, really interesting as well. I just popped it in there from a couple of different sources, just about the kind of types of people you'll get lurking about online, whether they're just browsing and having a look, or whether they're commenting, or whether they're actually then, what's the word, stirring up and actually trying to induce kind of harm, people to go out and cause harm. So it's really interesting, these different types of online people as well. Just a quick bit about a really interesting small-scale Scottish study, the more recent one. I was like, oh, they got in there before me. But no, I spoke to the authors, and it was one of the authors of a small study about people in Scottish in prison just now across 4 establishments that had committed hate crime, 4 that had happened in the community and 5 that actually happened within custody. And it was just really interesting, the themes that emerged from them. It was about their life at the time of the offence, what was going on for them. Again, linking back to that loss and grief and shame and the treatment they felt they were being received in prison. They perceived that sometimes they were treated unfairly. And they just looked at racially aggravated hate crime, I must say. They didn't look at other types. And, you know, a perception of what, oh, you know, and a lack of understanding, awareness of what was that really racist? Oh, I didn't, you know, so a theme that definitely comes across in people I've worked with in the past as well. And just about the implications of the prison environment on things like hate crime. It's quite a kind of quite a unique environment in terms of that, and the importance of kind of staff training and awareness emerged from that. So really interesting. Quite a bit about then and looking at what is effective in dealing with hate crime. Again, big summary of the research. It's, you know, can't do it justice here at all, but I've listed the main things. It should be flexible. There's no one size fits all at all. Non-labeling, non-judgmental. If you are working with people who commit hate crime, the last thing you want to do is go in a big stick and say, you're a really bad racist. What are you doing? You know, it's just not the approach that is going to work with people. Holistic, looking at the wider issues. There should be an educational component, as I talked there about. There's some genuine people who actually don't know certain terms, phrases, and so on. I mean, people can't just claim ignorance across the board with hate crime, of course, but there is that element about educating people, but without patronising. Victim empathy, really, really important. Helping people to deal with managing conflict in general. A one-to-one approach, group work. Some services, like in England, do a group work kind of for hate crime. It's kind of can go either way. Generally, it seems that one-to-one is better rather than kind of getting a group of people where things could perhaps be reinforced. Working with the person on the basis of accepting them for who they are and trying to understand their perspective. And restorative justice is kind of ideal where appropriate, because that does aid in terms of understanding the victim's perspective, and of course can go a long way towards healing the harm for the victim. Again, I'd love to be able to talk to you much more about restorative justice and what that all means and what it is, and hope people hopefully are aware of it. But can go into that another time. In Scotland, just a quick snapshot, we've, you know, we did have, there was a toolkit, as you'll see there, the ADAPT toolkit. It was launched in 2006, but not widespread adoption by social work services. I did bring it to Edinburgh once we discovered it for our social work service. SACRO run an excellent programme. It covers just, I think, 4 local authorities in the west of Scotland on tackling hate crime for young people right through to adulthood. No kind of national sort of social work policy or consistent, you know, intervention for that. But the new hate crime, some of the documents around it said that the training of community justice staff and building people's capacity to undertake kind of preventative work is important. So it'd be useful to see what comes from that. As I say, restorative justice across the board, there's some provision for it. It's not as widespread in Scotland as we would hope, but there's developments occurring obviously at national levels about the Restorative Justice Action Plan, getting it in place for all types of offending, not just hate crime. So exciting to see what that will bring. My research questions, I'm running out of time. So my actual research questions, try to focus them down to kind of three main areas. So looking at, you know, people's accounts of their offending, just listening to their narrative accounts. And it's kind of looking at what are the kind of micro level factors. So the things we've discussed there, the individual sort of motivations, what are the kind of meso level, so perceptions of, you know, of groups, all that stuff we talked about at the more kind of middle structural level, and then the kind of wider structural level. Are they factors in people's, you know, motivations to commit the offence? My sort of research paradigms are coming from, it's about, you know, hate crime is a social construction. You know, it's, and not all societies accept it or have laws about it, you know, and it's set in law in Scotland, you know, but there is something about how prejudice, you know, how it is constructed at different levels, how our understanding of it is constructed, and a kind of critical realism approach where we're saying it does exist, but what are the causal mechanisms and structures for that? And critical realism does try to look at, like, shine a spotlight and things and kind of trying to address inequalities. So kind of coming from it from a hate crime as a socially constructed realism. It's a real thing that happens. We know it is, but, you know, interrogating a bit more about it from the perspectives of people who commit it. So I've been my method's semi-structured kind of interviews of people convicted of hate offences. So I've tried to have a bit about some of the themes that I can generate discussion, but really hoping they will generate some new data, not just be beholden to the themes that are already seen from research. And I've been very kindly given access via some justice social work services to speak to people in the community who've committed hate crime, and the Scottish Prison Service to speak to people in custody who've been convicted of hate crime and are serving their sentence for hate crime. So only 4 interviews undertaken today. The pandemic hit when I just had got started, couldn't go anywhere, couldn't go and speak to people. It's only now recovering, systems are only now recovering and research access. So I paused it for a year, went off and did other things for the government, and resuming it again and thinking about with my supervisors, you know, I didn't want to do other methods. I didn't want to do more desk research on this. I want to sit down and speak to people. This is the whole point. I didn't want to try and do any other ways. I'm happy to do other methods though, like not if I can't travel into prisons or offices, then speak to people on the phone or online, because that's the way, you know, so much of us are conducting our business now, so there's no reason why I can't interview people in that method, thinking about all the ethics around that. So the very emerging findings, embryonic findings that I found in speaking to people, and I was totally not generalizable from 4 people, but the themes already, you know, for the guys I spoke with, it was four guys in prison serving their sentences for hate crime of varying lengths. The trauma that they'd experienced in their lives was, you know, you were hit with it in terms of their kind of biographical journey that I spoke to them about, and the kind of childhood adversity at the ACEs that they experience. Again, not surprising for people in the justice system. Substance use was, in all four, was a feature. They'd all been drinking. Again, nothing, no excusing of that, but it was there, it was around, and substance use had been an issue in their lives. It wasn't just a long history of criminal justice system involvement. You know, one guy, 80 odd convictions, and just all sort of different ways of offending. The theme from all four of them was, you know, it was that thing that unfortunately you kind of do here, again, working with people who committed it, is, oh, I would have said anything. They annoyed me. I would have, if they had been overweight, I'd have said, oh, you this, or if they had red hair, I'd said you this, or, you know, they sort of used that excuse, if you will, to sort of say, well, I would have just said anything. I just so happened to pick that they were, you know, whatever. It was mainly, one had been up for a homophobic offence and 3 others had been race related. Anger, that feeling slighted, and that anger thing, and the kind of shame, definitely, because again, it was definitely a couple, one shopkeeper, one had been like a friend who'd had a fight with, and remorse, and you know, I so far hadn't met anyone who said I would do the same thing again. I was absolutely quite right. So trying to unpack with them what that meant for them, and you know, exploring that, there was definitely feelings of remorse. That's said, again, such an interesting area of research, because you can only go with what people are telling you. So there's lots of caveats to that about, you know, they're sitting there speaking to this random woman who wants to talk about some prejudice is so personal. It's so personal. So I've had to reflect a lot on that about, are people going to tell me how they really feel? It's a very interesting thing. Hoping the impact will be all these things, understanding why directly from word of, you know, the mouths of people who do commit it. Perhaps there could be a shift in policy and practice on it if we get something that's a more evidence-based approach nationally in Scotland, even a national kind of risk assessment. I know there's moved to look at that for more this kind of counter-terrorism type work as well. Delivery of hate crime interventions, including any learning for restorative justice with this group of people in Scotland. Knowledge exchange with other agencies, and of course, obviously, people working with victims of hate crime and what that might mean for them and communities, and hopefully serving towards reducing victimisation and harm and kind of social cohesion, and obviously the kind of global nature of it, what can be generalisable from Scotland-based research to academic and national communities across the world. A bit lofty. Okay, so that's that. Thank you for listening. That's my university email address if anybody wants to drop me a line about any of this at all. And obviously, if any questions, my references at the end. Sorry, loads. I've tried to be really useful, hopefully quite targeted references from there. I'll stop screen sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rania. This is such an important issue of both significance and concern, and I personally have learned such a lot just from listening to you in the last half an hour. So I really appreciate your contribution to the seminar series and in rigorously researching this phenomenon.